Well, thanks very much to the organizers. It's a real honor to have this opportunity, and it's a privilege to follow my old colleague, Liam Pin. I'm going to set expectations at the beginning by saying I don't have any zombie bunnies to show you, or quite as cool videos as Liam Pin. Okay, so the remit of this talk is really the interface between transparency and sustainability. And there's a lot of expectations around transparency, similarly to new technologies. And we haven't really critically assessed what the promises and pitfalls of that interface really is. And why is this important? In the context of forest risk commodities, global supply chains, which is our focus. Yesterday, the Global Forest Watch produced a report estimating that an area of primary forest the size of Belgium was lost in 2018. We know that a considerable amount, maybe about a third of that, is linked to expansion of commodity crops. And we know that a substantial amount of that, maybe 40%, according to Martin and colleagues' recent paper, is linked to global trade. So how do we link these two ends of global supply chains? And until now, there's been quite some fundamental barriers to being able to understand those connections and then to actually act upon them. And there are at least three that I'm going to go into in more detail. One is the spatial resolution of the footprints, of the impacts that global markets have on landscapes where these commodities are produced. Another is the actual identity of the actors that are involved. And the third is the coverage of the connections, to what extent we're able to encompass the export and trade of an entire sector. And there are innovations in supply chain transparency that can, we believe, potentially transform our understanding in this area. One of them, you'll be surprised to learn, is trace. So I'm going to focus a little bit on trace because that's what we're working on. And what it's allowed us to do is take a supply chain of soy and Brazilian beef in this case, and pull out, in this case, Spain, the exports of soy from Spain via Bunge to one place. And by making that connection, you can then link actors to places and places to impacts. So what we did here is recalibrate this example, instead of looking at flows of tons of soy, to then look at embedded flows of hectares of soy deforestation. And as soon as you do that, you go from the top sourcing municipality of Sorriso in terms of volume of soy. You recalibrate the flows to look at volumes of embedded deforestation, and you move to a completely different place. So how can we harness this opportunity to really start to transform land use? And there's two giveaways that I want to add at the start in the context of two questions that I think we should always ask ourselves. One is, what information is feasible? And we would argue that existing data can often achieve a lot more than new data that new technologies might promise. And new technologies can often distract perhaps more than they can help. And the second question is, what is actually needed to start to drive change, transformative change in the sustainability of land uses? And we would argue that it's less than often is what is assumed. In the research community, we often want more than I think is necessary. And typically also, we need it sooner than we would like it to be ready to be available. So before it's perfected. So I'm going to go through a few different elements of this interface between transparency and sustainability. And first, just reminding ourselves as to the importance of telecouplings between land and global markets via supply chains. And there are multiple factors that are changing how emerging properties of an increasingly globalized economy. Increasing global demand is self-evident, but in agricultural and forest commodities alone, between 2000 and 2016, went from a total of about $500 billion per year to $1.5 trillion. Increasing market integration, increasing diversity of actors, and also diversity of products. In preparing this talk, I was interested to find out that in 2009, the value of intermediate commodities that nobody ever sees, the end consumer, surpassed the value of final commodities. So if you think about things like soy, soy meal, soy oil, things that are feed, things that we don't think about as end consumers. But there's also an increasing consolidation of actors. A very small number of players in the Brazilian soy sector that we are using as our kind of workhorse here dominate the overwhelming volume of exports from Brazil. And increasing importance of the private sector. Yet despite appreciating the nature of these connections, this concept remains largely unoperationalized. But we're moving into a space where maybe it can be, and it's been increasingly described as we're entering an information age with all of the opportunities and the risks that this entails. And there are quite a few definitions of this, and one that I think is quite striking is that access and control of this information is one of the defining characteristics of this era. And I think we're increasingly seeing that to be true, often not for reasons that we would like. And access to information is considered by many different sectors, not just our own, to be critical to resolving problems. And transparency is central to this because access and openness of data is obviously fundamental to being able to unlock its use. This is just one example, shipmap.org, which shows you the power of AIS data, the transponders on ships that are going around the world, which is now used by Global Fishing Watch to understand and identify the location of vessels on a real time. So transparency in this context in sustainability quickly adopts a mantle of similar to sustainability itself. Is it a game changer? There is a huge amount of expectation, hype if you like, that transparency can help demystify complexity, and certainly it can and is needed for that. It can also remove excuses for inaction. The world is too complex. We can't do anything about it. It makes problems more tractable, and it can empower more vulnerable actors who have access to information that they didn't have, thereby leveling the playing field. However, there are lots of caveats to that, because the collection of data is often costly. Is it the best use of our time and resources? Transparency is not always the same as access, and certainly not equal access. And choices are often shaped, the choices about what to make transparent and which indicators to choose are made by powerful actors. And this risks entrenching existing inequalities. And Lianpin mentioned a number of new emerging technologies, and I do think there's a lot of unfair, unreasonable hype around some of them. I think blockchain is one. There are countless expectations out there by actors who've never really thought through, I don't think, what the requirements for blockchain to work for a global supply chain like soy, for example, really are. But this is a distraction. I mean, it's not just a fun thing. It's an opportunity cost around which we could be doing other things. And the danger of this is that it creates lots of white elephants. And I think in addition to collecting data and making data transparent and accessible, what we need to think about equally is what are the stopping rules? What's enough? What's sufficient? What's the coverage? What's the scale? What's the resolution? And any one of you who's been involved in developing any kind of information system, whether a drone-based system or a platform like Trace, will know that the risk and the concerns about creating a white elephant that can't be funded into the future are very, very real. And we need to keep that foremost in our minds. But transparency is used quite broadly and quite liberally. Transparency of what and for what. It's commonly thought about just in terms of traceability and connections. And we did a review paper that came out last year, quite a few authors in this room, that tried to break this down into a simple typology, because of course transparency is not the same as traceability. It's much more than that. It's also about many other factions or facets of information that are far less readily available, but are equally needed if we're going to have a coherent and joined-up theory of change. So transactions and beneficiaries, access to the understanding about the relative benefit, the relative monetary benefit, if you like, that different players in a global supply chain will enjoy is really not available. The spatial impacts, we do have a lot of information on spatial impacts. Typically, however, it's not connected to supply chains. Policies, we have an increasing amount of information on policies, on commitments, zero deforestation commitments, for example. But also there's a dearth of information on implementation activities. What's the extent to which a given commitment has actually been implemented on the ground? How has the policy been transformed into actual practices and activities? And effectiveness is perhaps the weakest of all. Information, transparency around the effectiveness of policies, what's worked and what's failed. How is it delivered? Transparency isn't all public. There's a lot of transparency that's internal, whether it's within businesses, within governments, or on the consumer end. You only see what the seller wants you to see. Transparency around the label. There's a label, but what does the label actually mean? Public transparency, which is what we're focused on in our work in Trace, is trying to give direct information about the impacts, in this case, on sustainability conditions due to global supply chains, so that users can interpret it for themselves. And the concept of radical transparency is relevant in this context. Radical transparency, as we interpret it, is the disclosure of information that may be involuntarily given off by target actors without necessarily them having given their consent. And that's a critical element because you can't achieve coverage at the detail and the time scales that are needed unless we start to leverage the potential of radical transparency and the risks that it entails. Why is it relevant? I mean, transparency is relevant on many levels, but I think it's useful to think of three. One is raising awareness and navigating complexity. Trace has been really in the concept phase until the last year or so, and I would say its main impact has been an awakening of an appreciation about how we can look at supply chains in a different way. That they're no longer this indescribable, complex, impossible to comprehend system. Actually, you can start to condense and simplify and then conceptualize them in different ways. And that is a starting point for a very different kind of conversation. But once you've harnessed that potential and you've conceptualized things in a different way, you've got a different worldview, you can start making choices, whether they're about risks or targeting improvements. And then you can assess progress, and by so doing, you can start to negotiate solutions. Transparency in practice. There's been a boom of new platforms and information systems in recent years that many of you will be familiar with, and some of you will be working on other ones. And this is very promising. We, together with our colleagues in the Global Canopy, put together a network, supply chain transparency network, to try and just provide a bit of a learning community for these different practice groups that are working on different transparency platforms. However, of course, there are many gaps. Many of these platforms and systems, they focus on particular places, particular actors, particular commodities, particular impacts. And one of those gaps in particular is the way in which they manage to connect actors to places and to impacts, which has been the focus of our work. Because doing that in a consistent manner at scale, we believe is absolutely fundamental to driving change. And there's a balancing act here to be had that quite a few people were talking about in their presentations in the last few days. On the one hand, you have national level data that are used to drive global models, economic models to look at footprints, for example, environmental economic accounting. Incredibly important to understand that dynamic at a global level and to raise awareness about overall impacts, but fundamentally limited about providing actionable information for individual actors. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's been a cottage industry, a boom in the growth of companies that promise the world, that provide very detailed farm-to-fork traceability for your supply chain. But if we're interested in sustainability outcomes, we don't care about your supply chain. We care about solutions on the ground. So our focus has been in this middle space. How can we balance scale and resolution? So I'm going to give a few examples about how we've tried to do this with Trace, what distinguishes Trace from other work in this area and what it can deliver, and then move on to how we think, from our experience so far, transparency in general can try and drive a more transformative change. So Trace is an information system that is trying to provide a credible and objective source of new information about connections between actors, places, and impacts in globally relevant forest risk supply chains. So we are necessarily not focusing on everything, but on the big commodities that are responsible for most of the direct impacts, not just on forests, but on natural ecosystems around the world. And we're at the middle part of the supply chain. So we're mapping the entirety of the middle part of the supply chain. And so doing, compromising by not going down to farm and not going up to fork, but by having the full coverage. It's based only on existing data, and our vision is to achieve coverage of 70% of global trade in these commodities by next year, which is only a little daunting. There are four things that distinguish Trace from other areas of work in our view. One is the ability to be able to link those actors to places at a subnational level. And here you can see the movement of one trader, Bunge, across Brazil over time. So now we can look at that relationship between a buyer and a place and the impacts and the conditions associated with that place and how that sourcing pattern and those relationships change over time. That's an incredibly powerful entry point to a lot of analysis and research. The second is that by going subnational, we can start to distinguish the different impacts of different buyers. So here you can see a radically different spatial and therefore impact footprint of buyers of soy from Brazil, in China, and in the EU. And what this reveals is that whilst China, which is buying most of Brazil's soy, is therefore responsible for most of the total deforestation risk on a relative basis in terms of tons per hectare, because the EU, mostly by virtue of the logistics of the fact that the EU is sourcing from the north of Brazil, that's the real reason, has a higher relative impact of tons per hectare. A simple insight, but an important one nevertheless. Another distinguishing factor is the ability to identify specific companies. And this is key, of course, because that then allows you to relate to the relative roles and responsibilities of those companies. And 4 is the point that I've made already. This is blanket coverage. So there's maybe about 10% of the exports of Brazilian soy, and we are moving now into many more commodities that we classify as unknown. The others we consider to have mapped in sufficient level of confidence that we can take them back to municipality. And that's key, because we want to be able to look at net effects. We're not interested in the impact of a particular company on a particular place. We're interested in the net effect of all the companies that are sourcing soy, in this case, from all of the regions where soy is grown. And you can only do that if you have wall-to-wall coverage. So some of the things that Trace allows us to do, going back to my earlier and very simple typology, simplifying complexity. You take that huge complexity of the Brazilian soy system, over 2,000 municipalities producing soy, 1,000 traders, or many fewer that are really trading the vast volume, exporting to many countries around the world. You can simplify all of that to just look at total volumes here, or you can then look at the embedded patterns of risk. So if we look at total risk, you can then reconfigure in a simple way which are the actors that are associated over time with the most amount of risk. And this kind of simplification is incredibly powerful. As in the Oslo Forest Summit last year, speaking with a leading Brazilian trader, and she immediately reacted and said, "We want a smaller bubble next year." A few hours later, spoke to the CEO of a leading campaigning NGO, and he said, "We're going after the players with the biggest bubbles." And in a nutshell, that is the theory of change of what Trace is trying to achieve. We want to hold the hand and strengthen the hand of those actors that want to be out in the front, have a smaller bubble, and we also want to hold the hand and strengthen the hand of those actors that are chasing down the biggest bubbles. Second, it allows us to start to identify, in terms of taking action and making choices about risks and about opportunities, jumping off points, where to engage. So in this case, we can see the supply chain of soy from Brazil to China, and it's not equal everywhere. So whilst China is sourcing 40% of its total soy from the south of Brazil, that only constitutes less than 1% of its risk, because the south of Brazil was deforested a long, long time ago. Whereas the Matopiba region, which is one of the fastest growing expansions of soy in the world, Cerrado Frontier, they only source 8% of their volume, but that's commensurate with 80% of their risks. So Bosch, you've got a really powerful entry point to say to Chinese buyers, if you're interested in trying to reduce the risks associated with your supply chains, go to Matopiba. Start talking with people there. And that then gives you an entry point to understand with whom to talk to. So here's Matopiba, and you can take away a spatial map and replace it with a map of actors. Where are the dominions? Who is essentially not so much owning, but who has the most agency to drive change in different places? And here you can see that different companies dominate the sourcing in different places. So it's there and with them that you need to be engaging with first. Fourth, about being able to monitor change over time. The fact that we're able to connect actors to places and therefore to impacts means that we can set baselines for understanding effectiveness, in this case of zero deforestation commitments. And Ben showed this diagram yesterday in his talk, and it allows us to look at the comparison of total soy deforestation with the coverage of commitments. And you can see that there are places, Bom Jesus, for example, here, which has one of the highest levels of soy deforestation with zero deforestation coverage, commitment coverage. And with that, you've got a baseline for comparing change. We can then look at the total amounts of deforestation risk associated with committed and non-committed, with more committed, stronger, more weakly committed actors, and start to assess that over time as we drill down on the target dates of 2020, 2025, and 2030. Trace can obviously do a lot more than that, and one of the reasons why it's such a privilege to be here and to talk and see how the interest of different researchers have in trace, is that we really want these data to be used and unlocked in ways that we would never be able to do so. So you can download these data, and of course there are many different applications for this kind of data, combined with other data from other areas. More generally operationalizing telecoupling, but providing actionable information on a whole host of different applications, making LCAs more relevant by scaling down the impacts to a subnational level. Understanding, as Thiago was showing us yesterday, the extent to which certain buyers have persistent, consistent, sticky, if you like, relationships to certain places, because it's those relationships where we have more confidence that that actor can potentially drive more change in that place over time. How to look at performance, how to look at roles and risks, accountability, equity. Just one of those examples is an extra piece of research that my colleague and co-founder of Trace, Javier, has developed, which is linking trace data together with the AIS data that I mentioned at the beginning to provide the first estimates of shipment-specific emissions, GHG emissions, of exports of commodities. So you can then look at what's the difference over time in the total amount of transportation emissions linked to maritime shipping of coffee and of soy. And here, of course, because China is sourcing its soy from the other side of the world, it has a huge, much greater impact than Europe. And that's unfortunate if you're Chinese. But those are some of the realities that we need to start to take account of. So finally, in the remaining minutes, just thinking about what have we learned from this journey so far. Trace was launched in November 2016, talking with many colleagues who are working with us, many in the room, from this journey about how transparency can have a more transformative impact. And we came up with 10 propositions that I'll just give a brief synopsis of now in our World Development paper last year. Some of them seem motherhood and apple pie, but they're not when taken a closer inspection. And they're often overlooked. So transparency only ever is a means and not an end. And we need to, I think, repeat that mantra ad nauseum, because it often is the case, because it's easy to make things public. Companies, governments, other actors are rewarded quite quickly for making things transparent. And that can then slow down progress towards actually delivering implementation. Transparency is a double-edged sword. So I mentioned the example of the bubbles and that game in trying to get smaller bubbles and chasing down the bigger bubbles. This is a tricky balancing act. If we're at the helm of an information platform where we're trying to be objective, credible providers of information, we need to balance the books in various different ways. We need to be able to try and support transparency that's used sometimes as a compliance mechanism, which can be a threat, but also transparency that is used to build trust and help drive cooperation. There is a trade-off between transparency and the likes of Trace being used to name and shame versus being seen as just a greenwashing tool. There's a balancing act between transparency where we want to be able to encourage and reward actors that are driving change, but also keep moving the bar. So there's a process of continuous improvement, and we're always ratcheting up that ambition. How do you transition, for example, I think critically, from a supply chain approach where you've got an individual company making incremental improvements to a jurisdictional approach where you want an entire region to be able to attain a minimum level of standards? How do you keep the actors that are leading the charge on board without losing them as you go? More transparency is not necessarily a good thing, and I've referred to this a few times. And one of the reasons for that is that those that are making the data transparent, or those that have access to it, they can dominate the narrative. And they can then enforce conditions on those that are weaker in the supply chain. So the setting of standards by European buyers places an enforcement on smallholders in Indonesia or elsewhere to adopt standards, and they were never party to creating. And it can create real conundrums like the problem of what do you do about good actors leaving bad places? How do you encourage the leaders to stay in the bad places to reduce the deforestation and not just have the vacuum filled by the bad actors? What ultimately matters is changes on the ground, and I made this point, but to make it again. It doesn't matter at the end of the day in the final account what the performance in individual company is or what the effectiveness, as Javier showed in his talk yesterday, of a commodity-specific action like the soy moratorium is. What matters is the aggregate changes in deforestation or other impacts on the ground as a consequence of all of those actions by different actors on different commodities. And this balancing act that I've spoken to a few times. And just to repeat my first point, that here I think the critical lesson is what are the stopping rules? Not just the starting rules, if you like, of what you need to do in trying to collect the right kind of information, but when have we got enough? And what can we do with existing information? Greater transparency of one phenomenon can reduce visibility in another. And this has caused me to pause to think quite a few times, because we're faced with the challenge of selecting what indicators to put on the platform. You can't put all of them because that just results in decision paralysis, and people throw up their hands. You can't give 5 options for deforestation maps, even if 10 exist, because that just provides an excuse for somebody using none of them or doesn't help them understand which is the best. But if you choose one, you necessarily, by definition, reduce the visibility of another. If you choose deforestation over biodiversity impacts, you necessarily eclipse the importance of biodiversity impacts. Transparency, we would argue, should be public, but it also needs to be mediated. It needs to be curated. Who are the actors that do that? Arthur Mol, who's a researcher in Holland, who's influenced quite a lot of my thinking, talks about infomediaries. So the actors that are mediating the information. And Trace is one of those. How do we play that role effectively and in the long term? Typically, whether ourselves, Global Forest Watch, Spot, and many other of these platforms, they're housed and ran by civil society or research institutions that necessarily run on a project life cycle. We're in this to stay. We don't intend Trace, even though our funding is on a rolling basis, to just stop in 2021. We want this to stay open-ended. But how do we achieve that? Transparency is a process of continuous improvement. And one of the most powerful reactions that we've got from people is that this gives an opportunity to continuously shift the burden of proof. Historically, it was necessary for campaigning organizations to point the finger and say, you're connected to this impact, we found you out. Now, Trace allows you to say, you're plausibly linked to this impact, tell us how you are not. And finally, transparency is no effective substitute for effective governance. No amount of radical transparency, no amount of any kind of transparency will guarantee an outcome, more sustainable outcomes on the ground. However, transparency will not disappear, so it's our opportunity, and I think the research community's responsibility as well, to try and harness the opportunities, minimize the risks, and deliver what we can. And with that, I would like to thank in particular, I'm the spokesperson for our team. There's a lot of them here and a lot that aren't here, and they're a fantastic group of people who've worked incredibly hard over the last 3 or so years to try and deliver this. And thanks also to our funders and you for listening.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks very much, Toby. So we have about 12 minutes left, a few minutes to ask questions on this presentation, but then we wanted to have a broad discussion across both presentations, and again, towards the conference theme of studying and governing land systems for sustainability. So questions?
So my question, I think this is fantastic stuff, but if we reach a point where businesses need the database to say a certain thing for other people to do business with them, is there a risk of the social processes associated with data entry becoming corrupted? So how does the database that you're using get populated? I guess that's what I'm asking, really.
Right. So I would say yes, there's a risk. However, in our case, we're not using any company data. So this is based entirely on publicly available or publicly purchasable information, precisely for that reason.
Hi, Toby, great work. So you mentioned several times the concept of deforestation risk. How do you quantify that?
Yes, so thanks, Eric. Deforestation risk in our term is the amount of deforestation that a buyer is associated to proportionate to the relative amount of product that they're sourcing or commodity that they're sourcing from a particular place. So it's the exposure to the deforestation on the ground given their relative importance as a buyer from that place, aggregated over time, over space and then over time.
Just to push you a bit further on the question about the sort of integrity of the data that underlie this. My experience of, say, the timber industry in Mozambique is that the export records are complete nonsense by several orders of magnitude.
Yep.
Are there ways around that, or can you only work in sectors where the government records are valid in some way? And how do you know which are which?
Sure. No, good question, Casey. So we don't work in timber, partly for that reason, yet. But the caveat that I would add to that is there are strong incentives for the data to be accurate. It depends which data you use. So some of the data that we use are bills of lading, which are legally binding documents that need to accompany every ship. And there's a requirement by various actors for that to be true. So it's validated to some extent. But the main response I would give is, again, around stopping rules. Put it out there. If it's wrong by a few orders of magnitude, you in this case will come forward and say so. And then that process of calibration and improvement can happen. What I don't think we should do, unless we know something is absolute gibberish, is just hold back until we think that it's perfect, because perfect is not what's needed.
Okay. Maybe last question for Toby, and then we'll move to the general discussion.
Hi. So two small questions. One related to a question I've asked you before, but more broadly, I'm wondering, what are your plans for the future? Like we've seen a lot of work from Brazil throughout the, over the course of the past couple of days. Just wondering what your plans are for the future and where else you might want to work.
Yep.
And the second question is, how do you measure your impact?
Great. So the first question is easy. Our plans are big, and they include West Africa, going to our conversation earlier. But we're working on many commodities in Latin America, and also increasingly now in Indonesia, and Bern and Roman in the team who are leading on that work are here. Palm oil to start with, and then moving to pulp and paper. We're choosing the commodities based on a few criteria. Which data are accessible, and where is the greatest link to deforestation on the ground? We don't need to achieve coverage of everything everywhere. And in terms of measuring impact, an excellent question, and we're learning as we go, but it depends on which sector we're talking about. But one of the big ways in which we hope to measure impact is the uptake of these data to both by companies like the trader that I mentioned to improve, get their bubbles smaller, that would be an impact, and by campaigning organizations who are playing a role to squeeze those bubbles. So we're working with both and monitoring the uptake and the use of both in this case to try and answer that. But we are very interested. Lots of people here work on evaluation, so we'd love to hear your thoughts.